to the husband. It was also a society where children were under the domination of their parents. So, for example, a parent would sell a child out as a slave. And it was also a society where a slave, in the eyes of the law, was a thing. That meant that the children of a slave belonged to the master. And when a slave got old, he could be simply put out of the house and left to die. So even though when we read from Colossians, as we did today, and even from Ephesians, from which we read a couple of verses, we may think about the standards in our culture today and say, what was Paul thinking about? But I think to be fair to Paul, we have to view what he said in terms of the world in which he lived. And to that world, that first century world, Paul talked about these three sets of relationships that we've already mentioned in ways that were not only new, but had to have been shocking to most people 20 centuries ago. The thought about having a reciprocal obligation, husband and wife, parent and child, master and slave, was something new and for many people basically unheard of. Another way to think about it is in these relationships, there was to be a mutual respect one to the other. And Paul wrote this because in that first verse of our reading today, he talked about these relationships being in the Lord or in Christ. And that made all the difference in what he said about these relationships. So in light of his time, in his letters, he really challenged the prevalent thinking, the way people operated back then. And I believe we will likely underappreciate what Paul had to say in our readings today unless we put them in the context of the way the world was in Paul's time. So first, when Paul wrote, "Wives, be subject to your husbands," it was assumed back then that marriage was for the convenience of the husband. So what followed in Paul's writing would have been something that they were not expecting him to say. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. That doesn't mean that never happened back then, but that was not the way people thought about marriage in the first century. So we read it today and we ask, well, duh, isn't that obvious? We're supposed to treat each other that way in a marriage. But in the first century, that was anything but obvious. So Paul said, in effect, that husbands in Christ, key phrase, in Christ, had this goal, which was hopefully a shared goal, that the husband and wife could find in their relationship a new joy and even a completeness in life that they would find in each other. And as we read, Paul even said this to husbands in chapter 5 of his letter to the Ephesians. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Next, Paul said, children, obey your parents in everything. But in the first century, there was not a prevalent sense that parents were to discipline their child and encourage that child as well. Jewish people back then knew well the fifth of the 10 commandments that began, honor your father and your mother. But Paul says, in Christ, a parent is to discipline his or her child, but also to encourage that child. And the third of those relationships that Paul talked about in our reading today was between a master and a slave. So Paul wrote, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. And then Paul says that a slave's Christianity must make him a better slave as well as a better person. Once again, I think we have to evaluate Paul's words in light of his time. And what Paul writes about what we've called a reciprocal obligation between a slave and the master, that may have been the most shocking thing of all that Paul said about these relationships. That was unheard of, to think about it that way. Paul adds this to what he says to a slave. Whatever your task, put yourselves into it, as done for the Lord, since you know that from the Lord you will receive an inheritance as your reward. But then comes the clincher, which we might summarize this way. He said to the master, treat your slave as a person, not as a thing. What an astounding thought to first century ears. Paul was saying that the master has to remember that he too has a master, Jesus Christ. And the master of the servant is answerable to God because the master, just as much as the servant, works for God. Let me add just a few other thoughts about Paul here. I believe we have to say that Paul understood his call from Christ as sharing the good news of the gospel, sharing the good news about Jesus Christ, first and foremost. So Paul did not see his task as trying to right the wrongs of society back then. So, for example, Paul didn't go to the government and say, you got to end slavery. But he did, shockingly, share good news for the wife, the child, and the slave, and talked about how they all needed to be treated with respect. And as we look at what happened in following generations, Christianity was at the forefront of making some of these changes, bringing about some of these reciprocal obligations in these relationships, including ending slavery in our country. And in many ways, you could trace all of that back to Paul, who wrote in chapter 3 of his letter to the Galatians, there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, for all of you are one in Christ. Then we turn to Colossians chapter 4, verse 2, where Paul tells the Colossians to devote yourselves to prayer. Prayer for the Christian is both a duty, but also a privilege. And I think one of the things that Paul said in his letters was, keep praying, even if the answer to your prayers doesn't come as quickly as you had hoped. I read a book recently, a book that was kind of part of the Alpha course or tied into that. It's a book by Jeremy Jennings titled The Church on Its Knees. He had a lot of things to say about prayer in this book, about how they formed prayer groups in the church he was part of. But here are just a few of the insights he had about prayer in the opening chapter of this book. He wrote, I have always thought prayer was a good idea, but it has taken me a long time to see how much depends on it. Prayer is easily taken for granted, but its effects are felt in every area of our lives. Prayer brings results, but at another level, he said, it is one of the main ways of developing a deep relationship with the Father for which we all long. And Paul, in his letter, asked the Colossians to pray for him so that he might share the good news of Christ with those right there where he was, and where he was in Rome, in prison, as he wrote this letter. Next, Paul has some advice about how to live out a life of faith. He tells the Colossians, conduct yourselves wisely toward outsiders, making the most of time. And here Paul reminds the Colossians something we all know, but I think sometimes we kind of live, well, not taking it into account. And that is, none of us knows how long our earthly life is going to last. We don't know how long that's going to be. But I think sometimes we need to take a step back and consider what it means for us to make the most of the time we have in this life. And another part of what Paul says to them here is this: let your speech always be gracious. Now there's a challenge for us. There's an old saying, some of you may be familiar with it, but I was reminded of it as I read what Paul wrote there. And it goes like this and talks in part about our speech. It says, 3 things return not, even for prayers and tears. First, the arrow, which the archer shoots at will. Second, the opportunity left unimproved. And third, the spoken word, keen-edged and sharp to sting. And here's what Peter wrote in chapter 3 of his first New Testament letter. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet, Peter said, do it with gentleness and reverence. Then in chapter 4, verse 7, Paul begins to lift up people who were co-workers with him in the mission of telling the world about Jesus Christ. And what an honor it would have been just to have your name on this list, let alone to have Paul mention certain qualities about you. Paul calls Tychicus a beloved brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord. Paul calls Epaphras a servant of Jesus Christ, talks about Epaphras' prayers, and says that he has worked hard for the Colossians. And Paul also lifts up a woman named Nympha and cites the church in her house. And then in the next to last verse of this letter, Paul asks the Colossians to remind Archippus to complete the task you have received in the Lord. Maybe that was also an indirect reminder to the other Colossians to complete whatever task the Lord had given them to do. So as we come to the end of our walk through this 4-chapter letter, the letter of Paul to the Colossians, I remind you of a quote that I shared with you at the beginning of this study. It said that Colossae was the most unimportant town to which Paul ever wrote a letter. But Paul's letter to the Colossians contains some great and greatly insightful thoughts about the Christian faith. Insights that Paul developed as he was responding to the situation in the church of Colossae in that time. And finally note in the closing verse what Paul says. He asked the Colossians to remember his chains. Again, he was in prison as he wrote this letter. But still, Paul closes by saying to them, grace be with you. What a witness to the faith Paul made through this letter, a witness to his faith in Jesus Christ. And I'm sure he was hoping that this letter would be a guide and a blessing to the Colossians and would help them to grow into a more mature faith in Jesus Christ. And I also believe If Paul knew that his letter would come all the way down to us today, he would be hoping that his letter would guide us, bless us, and help us to grow into a more mature faith in Jesus Christ.